So, over the years, there's been a lot of weird games that have been released, and sometimes these games have been seen as deep and confusing and intricate. But there is no other game that you have ever seen that will actually feel as alien and out there and completely bonkers, in fact, as the one we're going to look at today. In fact, the feeling of alienation and being completely lost is an important part of this game and what makes it into a timeless classic. So it's more of an experience rather than just a game as such. And it's a game that will stick with you forever after you played it. I pretty much guarantee it, unless you just give up at all from the totally from the confusion and leave the game. But you shouldn't do that, of course, because once you've been engrossed in this game, it will take hold of you in a way that is, in fact, rarely seen in gaming. So now, before we get into the gameplay itself, let's set the tone here with a short brief on the game's premise. So now, hold on to your sanity here because things are about to get really weird. Um, However, understanding some of this background is essential to even begin to understand how this game works. So let's dive into Crazy Land, shall we? So the game centers around the player being a Vanger, which is a rather miserable life form fused to his or her so-called mech-os, which is best described as a car, but it has other capabilities as well. So you basically play as a life form fused to your vehicle. The Vangers spend their entire lives serving the various inhabitants of a set of worlds known as the Chain, which is interconnected by mysterious portals through which it is possible to travel along the chain and visit the different worlds, all having their unique ecosystems. You can see here that things are starting to get very weird here, but believe me, it gets worse. Speaking of these inhabitants of this world, one thing you will notice is that they are unique, to say the least. But let's start at the beginning of this. So, the origin of the whole world, or the chain of worlds, long story alert now, by the way, the whole chain of worlds in Vangers, which, by the way, the universe of the game is shared with the Perimeter RTS games that was released later, so it's kind of a precursor to that. So the origin is humanity discovering a wormhole, a way of traveling through space. So, because we are humans, we are fueled by insatiable curiosity, but also by greed. So, humankind set out to visit every single world that they could find access to. So eventually, they encounter the Crispo, and the Crispo is an alien race of insectoid creatures whose lives are very much centered around a hive-based society. They basically share one giant mind to begin with. This leads to a long and bitter war between mankind and the Crispo that rages across all worlds in the chain. So the worlds are then interlinked by the various rifts opened by the humans as they travel the universe. So then it begins to be referred to as the Chain of Worlds. The war spans the entire chain and is soon escalated into a nuclear conflict that destroys most of the habitable zones throughout the chain. But the humans were losing the war, and they need to find new ways of countering the Crispo. So if you can't beat them, join them. So now it was getting even more weird, and now it's getting even weirder. So humans begin experimenting with genetically splicing their own DNA with CRISPR DNA, forming mutated creatures inheriting from both species. So after a prolonged war and additional mutations, the CRISPR is pushed back, or they retreat, and they seal the entrance to their home world. However, now all these ex-humans are stranded within the chain, and the fusion of their DNA with CRISPR DNA have now given birth to a new type of actually horrendous society consisting of strange uh, mutated creatures that retains some form of humanity, but also has the insectoid traits of the CRISPR. So over time, myths about this war and distant memories of both origin species merge into extremely strange ways of living that is seasonal and hive mind like, but still vaguely human, and it's centered around strange recurring events that seems like part legend and part real life history. So there is like more to this as well, a lot more actually. But this brief intro should get you into the mindset here. And this is, once again, this is extremely weird. So you will travel bizarre worlds inhabited by all these bizarre creatures who will communicate with you using a language that is familiar to you, perhaps, yet completely alien at the same time, and they adhere to ancient and confusing seasonal rituals that and they seem to communicate remotely with each other. So you will start the game by being entirely confused and actually not understanding a single thing that anyone is trying to tell you. So not even your own form or purpose is certain at the beginning of the game, or even at the end of the game, actually, to be honest. And the creatures that you meet will refer to you as many things, from slave to hybrid to savior, and in no way is it ever certain what's going on around you. So you will question many things, including perhaps your own sanity, as you start transporting strange larvae that you have to dig up from the ground so that these larvae can be milked, as it's referred to, at some underground hollow, because apparently their scent, the scent that they secrete, is part of some weird ritualistic system that you cannot even begin to understand. Or you can take part in a reenactment of nuclear war, which is in this weird world suddenly played out as a car race that are staged by insectoid and crustacean hybrid life forms that live in a society based on constant surveillance of all individuals through using mysterious recorders with unclear purposes that every citizen has to carry. So you can see here that you will be in a state, as a player, you will be in a state of constant confusion as to what the hell is actually going on around you. And the way the game presents this is in an extremely straight up way, in that it doesn't even care to explain. So part of this experience is that it just drops you into all this madness and insanity and lets you learn the hard way. So you have to learn what you are, what is the purpose of the different seasons, what is the story behind these so-called counselors that you meet living in their underground holes, apparently communicating through telepathy. What are all these weird seasonal events that they keep talking about, and how do you play a role? What are they even saying, as half of the sentences seem to be complete gibberish until you actually learn. You start learning their language after a while. You start learning the expressions they use. But in the beginning, most of what they say will be complete nonsense. So needless to say, the first impression is harsh. But this is part of the game's appeal, because no other game will make you feel as lost and completely clueless, nor as small and helpless at the same time. So nothing around you makes any sense in the beginning, and when you think you understand, it turns out there's even more. So the game doesn't even tell you clearly what you're supposed to do, and not paying attention all the time can even set you up for nasty surprises later. Like, for instance, you can get enslaved as soon as you enter World 2 in the chain, and that means you will have all your hard-earned stuff taken away from you, and you will basically live out the rest of your playtime, the rest of your existence as a worthless slave. But unless you pay very close attention to all the gibberish that you pick up around World 1, because then you will have, by chance, a slight idea, perhaps, how to circumvent it. But the game doesn't tell you that, or it doesn't log it for you or anything. It just counts on you actually picking that up yourself, because if you don't, you will have a you will not have a fun time when entering World 2. Let me tell you that much. Um, so the storyline and the world and all the tasks are all confusing, and they're unforgiving and like one big cipher. And I actually never seen any other game be this obscure and very, very weird. So it kind of gives you an experience of being, you're in a completely alien world where you don't know what's expected of you, you don't know the rules, you don't know how these creatures interact. You feel completely isolated. Um, but as testing as that may be, it's actually an experience with very little comparison in gaming in general. So, technology-wise, the game was released in August 26, 1998, and it's made by a Russian firm KD Labs. And our firm is kind of an exaggeration because it's a very, very small unit. And all the worlds in Vangers are created with Surmap ART, which is KD Labs' proprietary terrain engine, and it uses a voxel-based rendering technique that creates dynamic and changing worlds. So the use of voxel structures to render the landscape means that it's possible to deform the terrain dynamically, and the world will change around you all the time. So if you set an option in the settings, you can even have all these changes persist forever as well. So if a bridge is destroyed, or you open up a large hole in the ground due to some explosion or something, these alterations will remain across your entire playthrough, so that you have to alter your playing accordingly, because it affects the navigability of the landscape. It's quite interesting use of voxel technology for the landscape. It makes it feel very dynamic, which it also is. The game is part of this mid to late 90s explosion of small Russian or like ex-Soviet indie development teams of small size, starting to deliver intriguing and like technically very impressive games. Because Vangers is a very technically very impressive game that had a raw charm to them, and Vangers is no different. So the game has plenty of bugs in its original state, and sometimes you can get stuck completely on the terrain and you're forced to load a save file. However, all the tech wizardry going on behind the scenes to deliver this ever-changing, dynamic, fully destructible landscape that you travel through is very, very impressive. The game's source code used to be available, especially in Russia. It has always enjoyed a cult status. So for the GOG, or Good Old Games, re-release of the game, the original programmer ported the whole engine to SDL and polished it for modern 64-bit systems. So many parts of the original code was rewritten from scratch in the GOG release. So if you want to play the absolute original release as originally intended and released, the GOG release is not that. But it was rewritten to take advantage of modern machines, and probably also because the game engine was very low level, so it needed some updates due to functions not being available in newer versions of Windows. But the changes also include removing certain things and changing like some of the controls and so on, but also removing all the cheat codes and making parts of the game even more obscure by redoing certain parts, because as the developer in charge expressed it himself, that was the way it was meant to be. So the version on GOG is to be seen as a remaster or director's cut, but plays more or less the same as the original release. Some controls are different, there are updates to the handling, but in general, the feel is exactly the same in general. But if you have an old machine that can run it, presumably a Pentium of some sort, Pentium 2 perhaps, and some vintage, note that it doesn't use 3D acceleration. It uses CPU-based rendering, so you can have if you have a P2 with sufficient speed, like a P2 400 or something, that would be ideal. You can, of course, run the original version, which is unaltered as originally released. So a special mention also should be made about the superb music, which is a mysterious and dark ambience that has become a well loved soundtrack on its own, actually. So, how do you actually play the game? Well, it depends on what part of it you're at, because the overarching structure, what you're expected to do, changes depending on what world in the chain you're on at the moment. So there are various central events that you must take part in, depending on what society you're interacting with. But in general, the gameplay consists of exploring the open world and visiting all the underground layers where the different so-called counselors live. And there you can purchase taboo tasks, as they're called, which are quests, more or less. These are seasonal, and which even if you get one available for purchase, and which one you get is determined in part by your luck statistic. So you have to complete the task at its set season time and then return the completed tasks to where you bought it from, which you also need to remember on your own, or you will suffer a great loss to your reputation, the dominance stat, causing you to be shifted down in the hierarchy. So the kicker here is that you can never know in advance what task you are going to receive until you've actually paid for it and then exited the lair. And thus, it can sometimes be that you get a task that ends in a time that makes it impossible from the start to complete it. And sometimes the tasks are also confusingly worded, or the description is mostly gibberish. So you cannot make out what it is that they want you to do. And apart from that, you usually carry some goods between the central hubs. So, for example, in the first world, you quickly figure out that the seasonal cycles are reflecting an ecosystem where two substances, nympho and phlegma, yes, really, those names, are transported between the starting hub and a place called the incubator. And you then begin to understand, hopefully, that in a certain season, the incubator gives birth to small larvae forms known as e-leeches, and that the event that takes part in the second cycle of the first world is known as the election. Get that pun? Election is a race where the Vangers compete with each other to safely complete the task of traveling with these e-leeches to the pod, which is the starting hub, where they will the larvae will the e-leeches will inhabit bodies that they will then grow inside of. So the winner of the race will be given access to World 2 eventually, and so on and so forth. Once you get to World 2, an entirely different system and seasons are revealed to you that once again needs deciphering. So you see how this that you get to a completely different society, working still seasonal but working in a different way. So in the second world, for example, called Glorks, you slowly learn that there are three seasons called the Progress, the Election of the Castaways, and Heroism, respectively. and that are they are entirely different than the ones on the first world. And of course, there's more gibberish terms. As an example of the language used by the game, in the election phase here on World 2, you learn that there's something called Jobleys, which will then drop something called Pipetkas that Vangers are supposed to carry to Ogorod. And that is about it in terms of what the game explains to you. So from there, you're pretty much on your own. And the third season of World 2, by the way, will host the nuclear war reenaction I spoke of earlier in the introduction, which is in the game known as War, where the same creatures will drop nucleobooms, which are actually fruits symbolizing nuclear bombs, and they will drop them around the landscape, and you have to be the Vanger who picks the most fruits or nucleobooms to win, so-called win the kernel war. Obviously, this is some repressed memories that are encoded in like the creature's DNA, in the DNA of the inhabitants, that some way harks back to the real atrocities of the nuclear war between the humans and the Crispo, but in this weird, in like some weird, bizarre way, it's been made into a seasonal sporting event between the Vangers. You can also explore the worlds. You can kill other Vangers and steal their stuff. You can spend your time running over small bugs that litter the landscape called beebs. So you can pick them up, and the beebs are the universal currency in the Shane world. So no one uses money; they pay each other with beebs, which are small, actually living creatures, small crab-like bugs. And if you have a high enough luck stat, maybe you're even able to open the entrances to some hidden caves that will contain cool stuff that you can collect or you can sell at one of the hubs. Along the way, you better upgrade your mechas, which is, as I said before in the intro, your vehicle, with new weaponry, armor, and in due time you may even have to buy a new mechas entirely with different, better stats. There's a few to that you can purchase that have different statistics, different characteristics. And as a player, you have two main stats to care for. These are luck and dominance, and these will change depending on the success and failure in completing missions and winning encounters with other Vangers, violent encounters out in the landscape, and so on and so forth. So you spend your game time traveling this desolate and like acid trip like landscape, looking for currency, fame, and glory, whilst trying to figure out what is expected of you from the different biomes that you come across. So it's completely open ended, and you can go wherever you like on the worlds you have access to. And once you open more worlds in the chain, you can travel freely between all of them at will. In general, the game just drops you in and then lets you figure out a path on your own. So this game is like the total opposite of the modern hand-holding game, because it doesn't tell you what you're supposed to do. It doesn't tell you how you do things. It speaks to you in gibberish words at times. It casts you out of important locations for making some small mistake in communication or protocol that you were supposed to figure out on your own from all the gibberish words spoken to you, but you obviously did not, so it locks you out completely of certain things. Also, it kills the player character a lot, like really a lot. You will get stuck in a swamp and you will drown, and you will meet insanely powerful Vangers already on the first world completely at random, who will one-shot kill you on the spot, and you will run into a hole, and you will sometimes run over a collapsing piece of ground, and so on and so forth, and you will get stuck and die over and over again, and you get the point here. It's not very friendly. So to characterize the experience of actually playing it, it's like exploring a very hostile environment while not understanding how anything works and not understanding any instructions that you might receive, while you're at the same time trying to survive. But if you keep at it, it slowly starts to make some sort of sense, and you begin to understand what you're expected to do, and then you start learning some of the pseudo language used by the weird inhabitants that you encounter, and you, in a way, start thinking like them, which helps you navigate the world. So there's only two views used in the game: the top-down driving view and the static view of the S caves, which are the hubs or layers used in trading and communicating with its inhabitant. So the control scheme is rather straightforward, and you can equip your mechas with devices that add abilities to jump and to be able to drive longer underwater and so on. However, the dynamic landscape changes as you drive over it and also while others drive over it, so it's easy to get lost or get stuck somewhere. And you have a map and a compass where you can enter a known, discovered location, and you will have a small bug that will point out which direction it is in and how far while you drive. But note though that it shows the shortest straight path. So if you follow it blindly, it could mean going off a cliff or dropping into waters filled with horrid monsters that will consume your vehicle. So people have often seen a few screenshots of this game and called it a Russian GTA clone or whatever. And while it has a top-down driving view, that is, however, the only thing it ever shared with GTA, as is probably clear by this point. So it's not a GTA clone by any means of that moniker. I can safely tell you that. So, in general, you drive around and you gape at the acid trip weirdness all around you while being confused and getting stuck a lot. And sometimes you would also get disturbed, perhaps, by some of the more dark themes and insinuated wordplays that are used at times, because it is kind of dark and sad in a way. And this sounds horrible, right? But the interesting thing is that it isn't. That's the weird part. A game that is this hostile and strange and directly counterintuitive should be absolute garbage to play, but it does draw you into its like madhouse world, and after a while, it becomes second nature, and you start to feel like a Vanger exploring the chain of worlds, and that is its greatest strength as a game. Now, uh, what do I think of all this then? Well, it's hard to speak of Vangers as just a game, like some other weird creations such as Pathologic, for instance. It's more of an experience. So like, there's no other game like it, and the harshness of it combined with the lack of explanation and the confusing world that it takes place in is probably as close as you're ever going to get to the feeling of alienation in a video game. So it actually genuinely portrays the very frightening situation of being alone in a new society with its own politics, language, and customs, all of which you at first cannot understand. And like anyone who has ever moved to a new country for whatever reason, for instance, knows this is stressful and very uncomfortable. And that's actually what this is like, more or less. But like in real life, you can also feel the curiosity and be driven by learning all the new ways and adapt to your new situation. And the game lets you do that at your own pace. That said, few, if any, other video games are so deliberately hard to get into. And on the surface, Vangers is very simple, with simple mechanics, but it still manages to feel completely impenetrable at times. And it's a very odd experience. Not even at the end of the game will you feel that you have a full grasp of things, and the conclusion of it is indecisive. And even the colors and design of the world feels alien, slightly oppressive. And the weird inhabitants, with all their ramblings, are scary at first until you actually start understanding them and their different motives for engaging with you. As to if you can recommend this game universally, then probably not, because it's obviously not for everyone. The confusing and trippy world aside, it's also slow paced and incredibly hard. It's even unfair to the player, and it's even aware that it is unfair. It just doesn't care as it wants you to feel like small and suffer all the time. So it's no power trip action game, that's for sure. But that being said, for a certain type of player willing to expose themselves to this madness and who also possess the patience to persevere through the game, it's probably the most unique experience of their entire gaming history. And still to this day, this game has a cult following, and that is for a reason. And it's one of a kind because it's completely one of a kind. And if you do get hooked on it, you will stay hooked on it. And after a while, you will even start feeling at home in the chain of worlds.